it is wonderful to be here with you today. What I'm going to do is take you through some material that will be hopefully a new way to think about both executive function, but also a new way to think about how a person with autism might engage their executive functions. So I'm going to show you a slide presentation that is way too big for a 1-hour presentation. But I decided to give you the whole thing anyway, because it might be food for thought. Some of it you can then read about more in detail in the book. But I realized that we will get to hopefully the most important key points during our session today. And then you can maybe look up some more as you have interest in it. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully everybody can see where we are now. And I have to do it this way. Okay, so this is my book that I wrote after this one, and I'm going to just give you a 1-minute explanation of how this came about. This book came about first. It was translated into Finnish by a woman who is an autistic savant. And her savant characteristics show up in autism theory. And she said, it is more important to teach a person with autism about executive function than it is to teach them social skills. Now, that was a little bit of a big surprise, like a massive surprise. And she said, you need to write that book again, only this time you have to write it for autism, because autism changes the rules. And that's what got the book going. One of the
or press 1 for more options.
Somebody needs to mute. So that is what got us started on writing the essence of the first book into the second book. And I started the first book with this principle of salutogenesis. And that idea came about as a way of understanding what makes the human being healthy. And Anton Bosky, the man who sort of coined this phrase, in his research came up with the determination that it was a sense of coherence, that we can find the world comprehensible, that we can find the world meaningful, and that we can find the world, that we can manage the world that we are in. Now, this is possibly not always everybody's experience. So do we understand what's happening to us? Do we find it relevant, meaningful? And do we have the skills or the tools that we need in order to work with it? So if those are the questions that we're asking for what we would call executive function, then now we need to ask what changes? Does it change if the individual has a neurodiversity? And in that sense that maybe it does change, because you can have a student who is having issues with anxiety, and that sense of coherence might be affected. You can have a person who has a learning disability of some kind. That sense of coherence can be affected. So it can be for very, very different types of challenges. But when you ask that question in relationship to autism, then you basically are asking a question, which is, how is the person with autism processing the world around them? And that's what needs to be understood. And the reason that I am putting this next term up there is because ableism is a really, really, unhelpful way to approach the world, because it is inherently is discussing who is able and who is not. But the question isn't really who is able and who needs to be fixed, but the question is, in what way are you able, and how does that work for you? And that's the fundamental approach that I'm going to take this morning. What is your way of processing the world around you? You may have autism, and there'll be people around that don't. Everyone processes the world around them, and they filter it through their own neurodiversity. So when we describe behaviors in the world of autism, for example, we have options. We can use language out of salutogenesis, comprehensibility, meaningfulness, manageability. We can use a term like coherence. What holds your experiences together? In what way do you modulate? In what way do you integrate? In what way do you coordinate? What are your competencies? What about your self-confidence, balance, self-regulation? These are good questions to ask. And you may not get answers for all of them, but the fact that you're allowing yourself to process that question means that you are looking for insight. And that word insight is actually pretty simple, and it's probably one of the most powerful words we have, because we are trying to look into what the experience is for the other. We also have a lot of naming words, which all have to do with pathologies, such as maladaptation, dysregulation, dysfunction, disruptive, defensive, faulty, lazy, unmotivated, unresponsive. And just reading through that list, and you feel sick to your stomach. So the reason that it is helpful to know the difference between which side of the language columns we would like to put some energy into, then this side that allows us to have insight is going to certainly be the more productive and also the more hopeful side. So let's just get a couple of basics about executive function out there. So executive function doesn't have a single definition that everyone agrees to. And if you look it up, you can find that everything from the dictionary to a medical journal or to online searches, everyone will say it a little bit differently. But fundamentally,
Sorry, my bad. Less attention for Miss Sloan tomorrow.
Somebody has just unmuted. Were you asking a question?
Please remain muted, folks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One of the simplest ways to approach this is by saying that our executive function essentially controls our attention and behavior. The executive function, just everyone probably knows that those are the functions of the brain that are happening here in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, in the front part of the brain. But what they do is they allow us to express our thoughts, how we think. They allow us to express how we feel and how we act, which is really those areas of comprehensibility, meaningfulness, and manageability. So this is where we go to find how are we going to relate to the world around us. How do we do that? So this is essentially what is this friend of mine, I call her Pia, but I'm afraid that her Finnish name might actually be pronounced Pia. I'm not sure. Online, it looks like it's pronounced Pia, but I've never spoken with her. And we have had literally tens of thousands of emails back and forth together, but we haven't ever met even online. It's a really interesting thing. But I'm going to refer to some of her comments today, because I think it's important that you know where some of these more interesting, challenging thoughts come from, because her experience is that of a extremely intelligent, highly savant, therefore a little one-sided also, in her ability to both perceive and formulate what it is that she experiences. We work hard together because she tries to get me to understand what she's talking about. And I have to admit to her, it's extremely hard work for me. I don't always understand how she formulates her theory. But one of the ways that she formulates it is that there is such a thing as autistic subjectivity, which is how she structures her use of executive functions so that she can engage with the world around her. And her autistic subjectivity functions differently than mine does. So this is where it becomes really, starts to become interesting when you ask about executive function, because it will manifest differently for the person with autism than it does for the person without autism. So we won't get into today to the span of the development of executive functions over the lifetime, because that goes a little too deep into the executive function side. I'm going to try to limit my comments to the experience of the person with autism, so that that can become a little bit more our focus. So this is again a quote from Pia. The autistic person would prefer to relate to the non-autistic world rather than adjust to it. Relating to the non-autistic world is their version of empathy. And this is the kind of clarity that she provides. If you really just chew on that one for a bit, you start to realize that how different it is to relate to the world around you than it is to adjust to it, because I adjust to the world around me all the time. And I don't always get it right, but that's what I do. And then the relating comes after that. So it's a very interesting, just a slight turn of the dial that helps us understand a little bit differently how this works inside of the person with autism and why it works so differently. So if we are asking a child to get ready to go, it's time to leave the house, they're not relating to the request. They're not adjusting to the request. They're trying to relate to this idea that you're asking them something. And it's just the whole point of adjusting to it and preparing to respond by getting ready, that comes sometimes so much later that the time is up and it feels like they didn't respond at all. So autistic objectivity is what makes it possible for the autistic person to discern that is a cat. But their subjectivity makes it possible for the autistic person to relate to the catness of the cat, the quality of the cat, the sounds, the feel, the fact that that cat is there that makes them feel happy. This is not having to do with the cat itself, not the individual cat. So just wrapping your head around even comments like this end up becoming really important when we're trying to understand an even more deeply embedded process called executive functioning. So these are other comments that Pia made that really sparked, what is now almost, almost 8 years of intense communication back and forth. So the autistic mind can be seen as a chaotic space that needs order. Now, that, she said, was her way of saying and sharing that the executive functions offer that. The autism experience can be structured via the use of executive function. The more functional the executive functions are, then the consequence of that will be that there will be more social function. And that autism requires more executive function structure and more precise executive function structure. And then this is her word, than normalcy. Now, that means that everything that we say about executive function during this presentation is going to be needed for the person with autism to be able to become precise enough with it that they can add it to their world. Now, what happens when these things are not coming together for the student? You'll have a meltdown and or a tantrum, which is not for every student will do that, or not every child will do that. Not even every adult will do this, but it can happen. And when that happens, the inner chaos is expressed as outer chaos. There's suddenly no differentiation between what's happening inside and what's happening outside. And so what looks like behavior on the outside is really a beautiful open picture window to what is going on inside. So that might offer a different way of approaching a tantrum or a meltdown. In those moments, your emotional and behavior controls are not working, and you are not engaging in social interaction. The person with that, in that moment of meltdown and tantrum, has no idea who you are, what you are. You're not even a cat, and you're certainly not the catness around. You're not. You don't register. And the internal structures in those moments are a little fragmented. So yes, communication is not happening. So this is her direct quote. I think that teaching executive function to people with autism is even more important than teaching social skills. Executive function needs to be learned first, and only then can we get to the social. I think that autism requires a higher degree of executive function organization to be functional than normalcy. The autistic mind is a space, often a chaotic one, that needs to be structured by the use of executive function. Now, English is her maybe second, third, fourth, I don't know how many languages she speaks, but this level of English never needs to be edited because this level she's got. Take note, you will get this handout. Take note that a lot of the umlauts are left off of her name. Unfortunately, I should have caught that. But if you just Google her name, about 6 of her little booklets come up. And I have helped her edit and helped her with the English on all of them. But if you ever want to get into how to understand the theory of autism, it would be a good place to go. I don't recommend it unless you're willing to read the books 2 times maybe, because they need to be understood by multiple readings. This is not lightweight material, but it's important material if you can get through it and get to the core of what she's saying. So we got the idea when writing the second book that the Autistic Kaleidoscope is actually not an inaccurate picture, because the inner and the outer experience for the person with autism, what looks like this is the picture of a flower that you're looking at. And if you look at it through a kaleidoscope, you get a lot of flowers, but from a lot of different perspectives. But what you do get is order and pattern. And there's something about the person with autism who can understand pattern better than those people who don't have autism. So we tried to understand that when we put the next section together, because in understanding, like the next piece is going to relate directly to the parts of the book. Let me just back you up for 2 seconds. For those of you who have not read the book, it is organized in two sections. The first section is all of the skills and the tools that we need in order to engage our executive function. The last section discusses the executive functions. And that is a little bit different than most executive function books. So I talk about what it is that we need as skill sets and ingredients before we start baking or cooking. And the baking or cooking is what we do with our executive function, but we need to know, what are we using? And we'll get to that in a minute. But for the book on autism and executive function, we needed a third layer, which are what we call the apps, the autism points of engagement. So autistic subjectivity, that's what the person with autism is experiencing. That's something that we can only hope to gain insight into. The way that patterns work for the person with or without autism is going to be different. And ordering and our executive skills to be effective is going to be individualized. So when we get to the executive functions themselves, what we would need to do for ourselves is going to possibly be different than what the person with autism is going to need to get similar outcomes. So remembering that she said that it is possible for a person with autism to relate to the non-autistic world rather than adjust to it as their version of empathy. And that autism is an experience of greater sensitivity and greater precision. So now let's take a look at that sensory kaleidoscope. It's really interesting because if you look at the person with autism in relation to their senses, then another thing that she said to me was that even though sensory integration is considered the gold standard of arrival at sensory integration, that's what we strive for. And for 40 years, there's been research on that. She says, no, not for the person with autism. They strive only for sensory coordination, not integration. So she said, let me just make it simple for you. Ask me to look at you and listen to you speak, but then don't touch me. Don't ask me to shake your hand too. Give me a job in a social situation. Tell me go take pictures. That I can do. But don't give me a job and ask me to talk to anybody. That's too many sensory channels. So I can see, I can hear, but then I can't touch. If I have to touch, then I have to drop one of the other ones. So her way of saying, most of the time, we are asking our children, especially with autism, to integrate when they sort of max out at coordination. So by asking for something that's more than they can do, then panic and ultimately rigidity, because that means the more rigid that I can be, the more you can't get in. So this is a really interesting conversation because every person will have a different level of what they can, how they can integrate sensory into it, but mostly let's start by reframing the question. The person that I work with or live with or my child, what is their max in terms of sensory coordination? Because what we usually find is that if we blow past that boundary, then when it's time for us to expect a behavior from that setting, we won't get the behavior we're looking for because we've missed a crucial piece of insight, which is, oh, I've put this child or person into a situation where they have way too many competing demands on their senses. So sensory coordination, this is just another way of saying it, but sensory coherence will lead to a higher level of executive function. So if the person has the right for that person, the right level of sensory coordination, then they are going to be naturally more able to access their executive skill set. So dysfunction, this is just a little, you can read this for yourself, but if your sensory processing is faulty, your response is going to be faulty. And therefore, you will be seen as disruptive. And that's just a basic principle that works. And the situation, of course, is going to be different multiple times a day. But this is the basic idea behind why we see some disruptive behaviors. So is there a way to give voice to autism by understanding it, that the person with autism speaks a completely different language? And it was really helpful to sort of tangle with the language piece with a person who speaks so many languages, because that made it clear to me that one of the interests I have as an educator is to discover how to translate any given student's experience. And by translating it, I become more able to hear the voice of that student. Now, it doesn't have to be a person with autism. It doesn't have to be, it can just be that student with whatever combination of experiences or challenges that person has. And if I can hear them for real, I will have a response that is modulated for that person. Now, that is, I think, what we are looking for in terms of what do we want to be able to do with our executive function. I think that's what we're looking for. I think we want to be able to modulate our hearing of the other, translate, and be able to give space for that experience without having everything be assessed against, is that like me? And if it is, okay, I can accept that. And if it's not like me, I can't accept it. So you must be wrong. I think that is a fundamental issue. And therefore, if we understand that is what's at play when we are working with a person with autism, then it becomes easier to be open to the idea that the person with autism is speaking a different language. And what we are asking ourselves to do is learn that language and possibly even get some translation skills. That's why it's so lovely that we have somebody willing to even translate my English into someone else's Spanish, because that's exactly what we're trying to do here. So I'm hoping that with the recording that all of the Spanish participants, Spanish-speaking participants, will be able to get the translation that will help them. All right, so I'm going to go through these languages fairly quickly because I don't want to spend too much time on them, but I want you to know what's here so that you can take some time, and if you feel like reflecting on it a little bit more, you can. But remember that we use emotions as a language quite frequently. And how we understand the emotion of happy, sad, frustrated, enthusiastic might not be how a person with autism understands that language. So here's a trick. When we feel like something makes us happy, sad, that thing may have zero connection in the experience of the person in front of us. So just because I become very, very happy or that child suddenly feels happy because they're playing soccer, doesn't mean that the person that's speaking to that child has any relationship to soccer at all. So therefore, that doesn't make any sense. We have to be really careful not to make huge assumptions about how the person with autism is experiencing emotion. There's social and pragmatic language. We know that this is the difficult one. And we know that we often speak with words, gestures. I sometimes think my dogs can actually hear my thoughts. Now, that's because we pick up on each other's micro messages. And by doing that, we make ourselves more socially adept. We become more aware of our surroundings. A person with autism may be picking up on micro expressions of a very different kind. The example that's in the book is where a mother, this is a friend of mine who was speaking with her son, who was at that time about 9, and she was explaining to him, we have only 15 minutes before we have to be out the door. And in those 15 minutes, only 15 minutes, and then you have to get this, this, and this done. She was looking at the clock that was over his head. So her image, her mental image, and I'm using this word very consciously now, I'm going to use it again soon. Listen for it. Her mental picture of time included the clock. Her words to him only meant she was saying something to him with a certain amount of intensity, and he was still trying to sort out something from earlier that day. She had asked him something about his school day, and he was stuck because he couldn't figure out why she didn't know, because he knew. So here she is talking about time. It's not getting through at all, because he was still trying to figure out, why is it that he can have something to experience at school and she didn't automatically know about it? Because it was his experience. How come she didn't know? It wasn't the massive disconnect. These two were working on two completely different planets at that moment. That is not exactly uncommon. So a lot of times when people say, what can I do to get my child to do what I ask them to do? The answer is, well, first of all, which universe is their student living in right now? Because if you're in universe A and the child is in universe B, that's going to be the problem. Until that gets addressed, it doesn't really matter what you say. So there's a lot of understanding for getting a sense for that. And there are, that you can, depending on how old the child is and who the child is, how you work closer and closer to get those universes to line up. How does the student respond to the visual language? Now, here's a tricky one, because this is, again, where I'm going to get to the link to executive function. How does the individual form mental images? I can probably say this 100 million ways, but what I want to emphasize is that for every human being, doesn't matter how old you are or how your brain is wired, in order to activate your executive function, you need mental images, because that's what we base our decision making on, our mental picture. And how does the student do that? So what is happening when I say to a student, you need to be ready in 15 minutes? I have an immediate mental picture of everything that needs to happen. I can picture shoes, coats, books, food, whatever. The student will hear, especially a student with autism, 15 minutes, And they will maybe have, oh yeah, 15 minutes. That has something to do with clocks. I do have a clock next to my bed. I don't really like it though, because it ticks. It makes me mad. It ticks. It ticks. I don't know what to do about the ticking. There's not a connection there. So this is a really important point to understand what is being created in the mind of that person as a mental image. Kinesthetic language is the language of touch, but now this is going to take up movement, and touch are going to take up sensory channels. So if you have a lot of touch going on and a lot of movement going on, you're not going to have a lot of still visuals or auditory at the same time. So which ones are you going to activate, and which ones are you going to try to turn low enough for the moment to be able to get something done physically? If you ask a student to engage in some activity, then can you turn the other sensory channels down low enough so that that activity can get as much of the sensory coordination as they can get? Sensory language altogether often has to do with our senses, but the senses in general. So differentiating them out is one thing, but trying to figure out what it will, for example, be if we try to touch, smell, taste, hear. What about the sense of warmth? Are you, in the moment that you are asking a student to listen to you and look at you, are they completely distracted by the feeling of being too hot, too cold, too itchy, too wet, too dry, too hungry, too thirsty? Things that we don't normally list out in our sensory list, but become big sensory experiences for the student. Now, these autistic access points are what I called in the book on executive function the ingredients. And we renamed them as autistic access points, but they are the foundational ingredients or tools that any person needs to be able to get to executive functioning. So you don't get to executive functioning by doing one clever thing like making a map or creating a chart. I find those sorts of things are rarely the answer. But what I do find is that if you understand these access points or ingredients, you start to get much closer, much faster with that. So now let's just take a look at this. I'm going to just go through these without dwelling too long on any one. In order to understand how a student functions, it's important to understand how their relationships work. Now, we've already talked a little bit about autistic subjectivity and autistic objectivity. This is where we see that if I were speaking with a student who didn't have autism, then the progression of relationship building throughout one's lifetime takes on different forms at different levels of maturity. But you usually think of this as a social act. You usually think of relationships as a social act. And if the student has a hard time understanding how those work or can't really reflect on them, they maybe never have really given any thought to how they react or respond or relate to other people. So even with or without autism, this is an important point. With autism, this is a very challenging point. I also engage students with a conversation about strengths and weaknesses, because no matter how old you are, every person has sort of inherent strengths and weaknesses. And as the older we get, the more we have put some energy into strengthening our strengths and kind of quieting down some of our weaknesses. But that is a lifelong process. Everybody will have some measure of strengths and weaknesses. There's no way around it. We have them. But depending on the age of the student and depending on whether or not autism is a factor, understanding what our strengths and weaknesses are requires a little bit of self-reflection. This next one I want to speak about with a little bit more intensity, because preview and review, if I were to strip everything away, and if somebody were to ask me, what's the one thing that you have to do to develop executive functions? My answer would be engage in review and preview by way of mental images. And you would probably look at me and say, what? And I would say, yeah, that's it. As far as I'm concerned, everything else supports that. Everything else we do supports that. Everything else we do with our executive function has to do with whether or not we can. Now, let me just assume all of you are people that can engage in review and preview. But if I were to say to you, we're going to be finished this afternoon, it's scheduled to end at 1:30. Now just pretend that I say, no, we're stopping at 1 o'clock. Your mind immediately does a reset of an image. Well, 1 o'clock, wait a minute. That means that I have prepared to be on here for another half an hour, and I will have a half an hour of free time. And then suddenly all the things that you need to do today pop into your head, and you start organizing and sorting. Well, if I have an extra half an hour, I'm going to go to that first, because then that will connect with that, and that will connect with that. And then by the time 1:30 comes along and I'm supposed to be off this call, I will have already gotten 2 things done, and I can already go to my next one. And that will then shift everything I have to do for the rest of the day. And I would say that anyone in this call probably does a version of that. And what are you doing? You are reviewing previous experiences, calling up whatever it is that is in your previous experience pile. You're bringing it into the present by saying what is the new change, what needs to happen now. And then you are previewing all the different ways that you're going to engage in the next half an hour of your time. And that reviewing the past, bringing it through the present, and previewing it out into the future by creating mental images, and boom, your executive brain is on full action. And when you realize that's what you're doing, and when you can hear yourself doing that, when you can feel yourself doing that, it is so remarkable. And so you just have to say to yourself, that is what I do. So as we realize that our executive function gives us an anchor in time, it allows us to reflect, review, and gather previous experiences. It allows us to bring it into the present moment with whatever the situation is, and preview where you want to go with it, so that you can make a goal-directed decision. And that is something that comes up a lot in the executive function literature as one of the definitions: the ability to engage in goal-directed behavior. So, wow, how does that work for a person with autism? How does review and preview work? You first have to ask the question, how are they making mental images? Because if we're going to review, that means we're bringing with us knowledge of previous experiences. We do this all the time. For example, something small. When you read a word, and you just know what that word means. Comprehension becomes possible because you've connected it, possibly through a mental image, with your previous knowledge. I read, it depends on whether I'm on the East Coast or the West Coast. I grew up as a child on the West Coast. So we always went to the beach. We didn't go to the ocean. We didn't go down the shore. I never knew what those things meant until I came to the East Coast. And now nobody goes to the beach. Everybody goes to the ocean or down the shore. And so now I have both options in my life experience to call on, to comprehend. If I hear, let's go to the ocean, I don't have to translate that into let's go to the beach, because I can, through my executive function, I can immediately bring those things together as one in time. If I were to say, how much do you need to do before we have to leave in 15 minutes? I use that process. Well, previous experience tells me about what 15 minutes is. And previous experience tells me that before I go out the door, it's shoes, coat, brush your teeth, go to the bathroom, get your lunch, whatever it is. And I know that I want to be in the car in 15 minutes. So here's my goal-directed decision. I start grabbing and pulling, and anyone who's a mother with children at home will know how to do that almost simultaneously, but always do it because you have that picture in your mind of the finished product. Child is ready for school. And you don't have to separate each thing out. That is executive function in a normal situation. What is executive function in the world of a person with autism? You still have to back it up a bit and ask, well, in their environment, when there's a coat hanging in the coat room or in the garage or wherever it is, how are they relating to that coat? Do they see that coat as something that all they have to do is grab it on the way out the door? Or do you make a new relationship to that coat every time you see it? It's very different. Therefore, your arrival at good executive functioning skills is going to be very different. And this is one of the reasons why it doesn't really work to rely heavily on a checklist or, a calendar. Those things can be really helpful, but they are a tiny little piece of the understanding of how it might be manifest. How do you work or learn? If you think about sometimes even students with autism, and maybe there can be considered, it's obviously quite a spectrum, but if the student is the kind that needs a little flip card to show a coat, then you know that student is going to be responding to the coat as a single item. It's not going to be part of a review and preview. But if you were to lay out the cards on the table from the student with nothing on to the next one, the student with the boots on, the student with the coat on, the student sitting, with the sandwich bag in the hand, and the student sitting in the car, that would be more reflective of what is this review and preview process that we're going through. So again, there's no one single thing that we can point to that's going to be the magic bullet. But now I'm going to jump over self-advocacy because I get irritated when I see this, because in no situation that I've come across are self-advocacy skills well managed. And in too many times I've seen students accused of being unmotivated, and therefore they don't speak up for themselves and don't get their work done and blah, blah, blah. We're going to jump over it so that I don't get on a soapbox about it. But the next one is also important. Whole to the parts and parts to the whole. So when we approach any student, and a student with autism for sure, we need to be careful how we're thinking. Are we giving that student the big picture and then having them sort through all down to the little component parts, which is an analysis approach? Or are we going to give them single pieces and gradually build it up to a whole picture? And that's going to be your synthesis approach. I would suggest that this is one area where teachers, I mean, yes, students all need to be able to do both, but whether we do one or the other kind of predominantly, or whether we overemphasize one or the other, that's just something to watch out for. I know we're getting close to the time we want to do questions, but let me just blast through these last ones. Motivation and incentive, opposites. Motivation is intrinsic inside the human being, and it cannot be messed with from the outside. So it is a little bit of a misnomer to think that you can motivate somebody. It doesn't really work that way. You can offer incentives in the form of rewards and punishments, but motivation, we're kind of born with it. We are all motivated. I've never met a person with no motivation. That just doesn't exist. But I have met people with varying responses to incentives. So that's just something to think about. Rhythm and routine. Rhythm being something like your birthday that comes around every year, but it's never the same birthday twice. And routine, which is the kind of routine that you want to have so that you can really get into almost muscle memory. It's routines we need both rhythm and routine, essentially. They both give us strength. They both are very, very important. And our routinized behavior are sometimes more extreme because it's a little bit harder to get into a rhythm, but they both eventually are part of the human experience. Implicit and explicit is on this list just mainly because in my work with students with executive dysfunction, so it was called, it was hard sometimes to understand implicit information, and explicit information was understood differently than I meant it. So it wasn't always an easy communication point. Now, let's take a quick look at the executive functions themselves and then use some of what we've just spoken about to understand how to apply it. And I think once we get through this, you'll realize why this amount of material is usually for a day or 2 days of workshop. But this will give you something to think about, and it will give you some ideas of further investigation. In all of the lists of what are executive functions, attention often doesn't make the list. And yet, attention and behavior are what executive functions control. So whenever I do a larger workshop or a longer workshop, I really get into what is attention actually, because most of us don't understand what attention is. And on another level, and way too much for today, but just to say, autism and ADHD can be co-occurring. And it doesn't mean that if you have one, you can't have the other. Not at all. You can have both. How we process our memory, how we learn, is also very variable and important to understand because it will have to do with how we process. So whenever you get a neuropsych report or something like that, what you'll see in there are a lot of processing numbers, because the way that we process memory is actually going to impact how we can learn. The next two I've separated because they're massive and everyday executive functions, but organization has to do with much more how we organize our physical world. If we're writing, it's how we get our ideas on the paper, just even get them out before they become organized. But time management has to do with other activities like, do we picture time? Can we prioritize? Because if we can prioritize, it means we can picture what we need to do, and we can picture an order of what should come first. And that will come up in everything we do. If we, for example, can do that with our schoolwork, that's one thing that's great. We can organize what comes first. If we do it when we write a paper, yeah, what needs to come first. But what about when we put on our shoes and our coat? Which one goes first? But why? What's the time priority that we have? That your shoes are on the other side of the room, so you should do those last, and your coat is on this side of the room, so you should do that first. Is it a spatial priority or is it a time priority? What are we doing with our picture of time? What was 5 minutes ago? What is 15 minutes from now? If you have no access to picturing time, then it's not really going to work. So picture time. How does that student, how about this boy in the kitchen with his mom? 15 minutes was just sound waves for him. There was no picture in his mind about that time period. In her mind, she had it down to the second. She could picture every single tick between now and 15 minutes from now. He could picture nothing in relation to time. This is a really key difference in how the different brains process executive function. Now, inhibition and initiative are both stop and go buttons. And so inhibition is, do we inhibit behavior? Well, we can only inhibit a behavior if we can see, if I were to do that, I gather my previous experiences about the last time I hit somebody over the head with a brick, and I can look ahead to the future. If I were to hit somebody over the head with a brick, it wouldn't be good. So I'm going to decide not to. Now, I will inhibit my behavior because that process of realizing what's going to happen if I do was so quick that you could decide to inhibit. Initiative is almost the opposite. If you have to take initiative to start something, you have to picture what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, what needs to be in place so that you can do it, so that you can start the action. If you slow these processes down to that kind of clarity, then you understand why inhibition and initiative are two sides of a coin, but they are dependent on being able to review and preview and form a mental image. Flexibility, being able to change, whether it's your thinking or an action, or be flexible in how something makes you feel. This is huge. But if you think back to the autistic subjectivity and autistic objectivity, where's flexibility in that? Control of behaviors and emotions is obviously belonging to your executive function, where you make a ton of decisions in order to exert control that might affect your behavior or your emotions. And ultimately, goals are kind of a tricky word in executive function work because all action is goal-directed behavior. So it's important to be able to really think about those things. Now, I'm going to stop in the next minute or two, but I'm just going to give you a brief picture of what comes on the slides so that you can read for yourself a little bit more about executive function, read a little bit more about attention and the attention controls. All of this is stuff that I work through with people if I do a day-long workshop. So I'm really trying to give you that for yourself if you choose to think about it and to go through it. But what I'd like to, oops, I went one too far. What I'd like to end with is that there are some golden rules to remember that might make this amount of information more manageable. And that is that sensory coordination is more important than sensory integration for the person with autism. Autism means you have a greater degree of sensitivity. autism means we need to understand which language gives the person with autism their best voice. It's more important to teach a person with autism executive function than it is to teach social skills. And finally, change happens slowly. And if you're going to want to make a change in your child's experience, only start with one thing at a time. Nothing is going to happen if you start to try to change too much at once. So with that, I think there looks like there are quite a few questions. Melissa, how would you like me to
Wow,
do
I'd be
this?
glad to read those to you, and
Well,
thank you. This is
I think
great.
there were, some,
Yep.
there might be too many to read through. We might not.
Some were similar, some were similar.
Yeah, so let me just go up through them a little bit. Learning about executive function support for autistics, 18, not enrolled in college, right? So that's more in the workplace and through organizations like DOORS and things like that, I'm sure. You work with loved ones on this, that's the hardest of all. And many of you are talking about the older teenagers. And what you really want to think about with the older teenager is, and also the student who's not in college, and the kind of almost adult person, is not to worry that they haven't made it to, so to speak, their executive functions haven't fully developed. First of all, the executive functions really only fully develop around the age of 30. And instead of asking, how is this person doing with all of their organizational skills and practical skills and responsibilities, ask, how can you figure out together with them, how do they see the world? And find out how they see patterns and how they want the world to work to best suit the way they work. And that might give insight into how to bring about some practices that might make change. In the public school, now this is a really good question, because one of the things that I've done is I've given multiple presentations to the teachers in, for example, Baltimore County Public Schools, about how to get basic executive functioning thinking going as teachers, and what is an appropriate kind of expectation to put into the classroom. So I agree that that is a big, big issue. So as your students are going through a public school setting or even a private school setting, it doesn't really matter what their school setting is. You can't not care about social skills, but when Pia said it's more important that they learn executive function, think about one of the ways that you can practice, even if all you do with your student at home is practice creating a mental image with review and preview. And in my book, I actually give a couple of descriptions of ways that you might want to try that. That's a foundation skill. That's kind of why I like to point out foundation skills rather than tricks, because the foundation skills, they develop long and slow, but they are so essential. If your student can start to make a mental image, and if you say 15 minutes, find out, what is the student hearing? If you ask, so today, what was the last period of your day? What happened just before? If it was, Spanish, what happened just before Spanish? What class were you in? See if you can get them to give you a picture in a review of their day. And you might find that those foundation skills go further than almost any other kind of thing.
Paula, there's some questions about if somebody were be looking for a professional to work with their child. We do have somebody, on the asking about older teens in college, not in college, but then also a child as young as 4. And where would someone seek that kind of support?
Well, those are two different worlds of people. So for the 4-year-old, of course, you need somebody who actually understands early child development, and you need experiences and not teaching. You need the 4-year-old is immersed in the world and almost is still learning a lot through imitation. The college student or the late high school student needs something different. They need somebody who is willing to go through a process with them. So a good counselor might be actually not a bad place to start. Courses that are given through places like Landmark College that are online. There are organizations that work with executive functions specifically. The woman's name is, it's just out of my head right now, but I'll come back to it in a minute. But there are a couple of online options for executive functions specific in relation to students and learning in school. But more maybe would be, think about how is that person with autism processing the world around them. So for example, when students with autism would come into my office, I would do a real quick, I don't know, sensing of it. Do they just need a body double? Do they just need a silent person sitting there so that they don't, so they can know that they won't be bothered? And then they can get their work done? Or do they actually need somebody to help them formulate a different kind of picture of what's going on? So there is no one single answer. How to find those people is probably the hardest of all. And sometimes they're not people who are specifically executive function coaches. There may be people who just know how to respond and engage with some of these basic knowledge pieces of how does that person with autism engage with the world. I'll work with that rather than create an environment that they have to adjust to. So sometimes it's the most unexpected person who's just got good instincts or maybe a bit of background knowledge. I don't have a list, though, unfortunately, of people who are officially in this area of executive function and autism. And I think that's why there's such a strong response to a webinar like this, because there just isn't that much out there.
Right. And a couple questions in here about working one-on-one versus help through a peer or a social group for any executive function skills.
One-on-one for a person with autism might be more manageable, because the minute you put a person with autism into a social peer situation, there are a lot of variables and uncontrolled elements that might become overwhelming very quickly. Think about what we said about sensory integration and sensory coordination. You might say the same about social integration and social coordination. You might have to be very careful about how many inputs are coming towards that person, which is another reason why workplace issues become important, because sometimes it's a social overwhelm and sometimes it's just simply a sensory overwhelm that creates a response that might be read as inappropriate behavior.
Another great question about a young person who doesn't feel she needs to build these skills. Not being defiant, but just doesn't see the need for it. 13-year-old daughter.
Yeah. Well, because a 13-year-old is so busy trying to just keep their balance that the idea that these things are skills, it doesn't make any sense. So I wouldn't call them skills. I would just simply say, then no problem. If you have an assignment, what kind of approach works for you to get it done? Because if you don't get it done, thinking forward, is that an option that you would like to choose? I won't get it done. So find out, is your goal to get it done? Good. Then talk with me a little bit about some of the ways that you can picture yourself doing that, and about how much time do you think you will need. And that kind of conversation will be much more effective with a 13-year-old than a this is what needs to be done, and this is how you're going to do it, and this is the skill I'm going to teach you, and this is the way that I'm going to teach you, because that can't be processed. That doesn't make any sense. So their response isn't that they don't want to learn it, but that's the form that they can't take it in.
Understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Also a question on when teachers don't understand that a child is not, being defiant or, and I would extend that maybe to, family members, friends, not understanding as well. And how do you explain this to the,
That's one of the most difficult areas, because teachers are themselves subject to their own foibles and fallibilities. Sometimes we call it dysteachia, but that is a problem. And I think if you could, first of all, have a individual conversation with that teacher as often as possible, make it private first. There are going to be situations where teachers are not receptive to what you have to say, and then it becomes a bigger issue and more public. And I do understand that that does happen, and it will continue to happen. But if the teacher is simply not informed, then with respect and clarity, explain that a different approach might actually work. And if a student does have an IEP or a 504, those accommodations should be written into that IEP or 504 so that the teachers can be guided to something objective, not just your wishes against their wishes, or your attitude about this child, your child, and their attitude about the child. It can be something third-party objective, which is important. If you have family members, again, I would always talk with them first. I would also acknowledge that sometimes family members are not going to get it, and maybe distance is not a bad thing always, if you're trying to protect your child from somebody's overt and active misunderstanding of the situation or what's helpful. There are times when just keeping people more apart than not doesn't work. But these are all places where I think then, as it would be with or without autism, when these things happen, you might need the help of a professional, a counselor, somebody who can really guide you as a family through some of these more horrendous situations, which, if there were something simple that could be done, I would be first in line to recommend it every time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's always a challenge. And I want to thank everybody. Lots of good resources being posted and shared. I know that the Autism Society has resources, Pathfinders, other people are posting for Maryland Coalition, and so certainly other good resources out there. Paul, I want to make sure too that before we let you get away,
Yeah.
there's been some questions about, or comments of people have read your book. Where would be the best place to get a copy of your book? And
As far as I know, all of the online options have it, but Amazon has it probably cheapest, and it's
Mhm.
also a Kindle version.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So I think both of those would be possible.
Okay.
And
And
yeah,
also,
I'm just
when are you doing, this was another question, will you be offering a full day session if anybody's interested, and could that, oh, thank you, Neil. Neil's got the link up. He's so quick.
I don't have anything on the books right now
Okay.
for that. I am going to be doing a all-day session in Texas, believe it or not. There was a school district in Texas that studied my first book, and they won an all-day workshop on it in June. So that I have, but I'm afraid that's a little far away. It's also
Well,
specific to their school district, so.
We may need to bring you back for a full day, I think. This
It
feels
would
like
be,
it's
it
been
would
so
be
long.
fun. I think the idea that working together, see, for me, it's always, is there a way that other parents can work with other parents? Because every single one of, if all of you are parents, you all have a different child. And so people can help each other if they understand children, and then you can take that understanding specifically to translate your own home language, whatever that might be. I think this is, which of her two books is best to start with. If you have this handout, then if you want to understand the basic background of where this whole thing of everyday executive function comes from, it's in the first book. Some of that material showed up again in the second book, but I brought the material from that second book into the handout in more detail. So you can see whether if you only want one or the other, then you might use the first book as your foundation material and the handout as your what wasn't in the first book. That might be one way to think about it. Because the handout is really, like I say, it's just too big for being able to understand what's going on in just an hour and a half.
Okay, very
but
good. Thank you.
there's
I
a
see
lot there.
lot of calls for a full day session. So Neil, you might need to talk about that. I think it would.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so
And we could do that even virtually if you wanted to, because there's an awful lot of material that you can work on and then even do breakout rooms for, because the idea there that it just takes time to understand what's the background, what's behind all this. And I think that's why it is an important topic, is because we all have executive function. And everybody wants to understand that part of oneself, as well as understand it for one's student or child.
you know, we have some autistic adults who are on the webinar today, so
Mhm.
as well. I mean, I think a full day session could be really
Yeah,
helpful to
yeah.
gain that understanding.
Well, I think that would be amazing. And I know that I really always thank Pia or Paya, I don't really know how to pronounce her name, because she has pushed pretty hard to get me to understand what doesn't come easily. It doesn't make sense when you hear it the first time. And I really encourage anyone who has an interest in understanding the theory to look into her little booklets on Amazon. You know, the Kindle books are $4 or $5, they're not much. But it's hard. Somebody just said it's hard to model if you EF skills if you don't have them yourself. And I think that is exactly where most of us start, is trying to figure out what are my personal EF skills, because with what I understand about me, I can be more helpful to somebody else.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Paul. That's great. And Neil
Yeah.
is logging off. Thank you, Neil. And thank you to Pathfinders for co-sponsoring this. We do just have a few minutes. I just wanted to tell everybody we have another brown bag session coming up in March with Dr. Pamela Compart. We'll be talking about autism and gut health. So we're looking forward to her. She's
Ooh,
a
nice.
developmental pediatrician here in Columbia. So please look for that. And anything else in closing, Paula? And I'm gonna
Well, just to say, I really believe that as parents of children with autism, you get a second job, which is that of translator. So a lot of times you're going to find yourself asking yourself the question, what language is my child speaking right now, whether they're 7 or 17? And do I know that language? Can I understand? And if the student is older, engage them in trying to help with the translation, because they need to know what language they're speaking to. So yes, as translators, we really, our biggest effort is to give that person their voice. And that's really what we want to do with all of this work with executive function. So it's been nice meeting you, so to speak. I know it's hard when you can't see each other in person, but it's been really nice to be able to be here today.
Thank you, Paula, very much. And just a reminder, we will be posting the recording. Give us a few days just to clean it up a little bit. And Paula's will share maybe the link for the book and also for PowerPoint. So thank you again so much.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we'll look forward to a full day soon. I
That
hope.
sounds great. Okay, it's been
Thank
great,
you.
great to be here.